grazie. Grazie, grazie. That's my total of my Italian is grazie or grazie mille, although I can say buongiorno as well. So bear with me otherwise. The reason that I'm here, I made this joke last night at dinner. I said the reason I'm here is to explain to you why America is the greatest country in the world, which is actually not why I'm here, and we all know that that's not the case. But no, the reason why I'm here is because I became friends with a gentleman who founded a fintech company whose primary purpose in life is to help facilitate the global shift that is happening around us. Now, it's sort of curious to try to explain why somebody would be involved with fintech who's obsessed with the global shift and what even is the global shift. Well, the global shift is something that we're all at least aware of if we're not living it. The global shift is a move that is larger than the first industrial revolution or the second industrial revolution. The global shift is a multi-trillion-dollar change in the cars that we drive, the real estate that we live in, the way that we communicate, the way that we produce, distribute, and consume food and product globally. The old model is a carbon-based, oil-based, centralized model that was built by the banking infrastructure to provide those assets. The new model is a model that moves away from carbon into the distributed universe, and it can only move in that direction to the extent to which there's financing to make it happen. I'll give you an example. In California, which is basically its own nation state in America, completely detached from the rest of the country in almost every way, they just passed a law in which it is now illegal to sell a new home that doesn't have solar panels attached to it. That is a function of the liberal politics of California. It's probably a good idea. It's also impossible without financing and fintech. And so when you look at that example of the intention to convert, let's say, every building in Italy to a renewable power system, whether it's attached to the buildings themselves, like the glory of what's the name of the famous building here in Milan with all the bushes on all the whole building's a bush. There's those two skyscrapers, hanging garden. Well, the entire country is going to go in that direction, and the question is only a function of how fast that happens. The reason California can move to an environment where the solar panels on every house can be mandated is because there's a banking relationship and a fintech relationship that makes that possible. Up to this point, the global shift, whether it's the move to electric cars and Elon Musk, has been a government-subsidized venture because we think it's a good idea, because it feels good. But the economics of it have made little or no sense. We've now crossed over the tipping point where the rate at which we will transition in the global shift is a direct function of what people like you do. And so I would ask you for a moment not to think of yourselves as bankers or technologists or service providers, but literally as the foundation of the global shift. We will not see the transition that we all are depending on to migrate away from carbon, away from a centralized, fragile system, to a resilient, adaptable, free, mobile, post-carbon system, unless the banking system facilitates that outcome. It sounds like an obligation. But the truth is, if you look at the amount of money that was made by J.P. Morgan when we built the railroads in the United States for the gold rush, the first industrial revolution was fairly profitable for banking. Created the banks. In fact, the opportunity to make money in financial services relative to the global shift is, at this moment, reaching its maximum potential. The reason I say that is because the level of confusion and uncertainty about what is going to happen is still very high. The cultural shift to accept what's happening generationally is reaching critical mass. And those who are willing to step into that confusion to actually help the human beings whose problems are universal and go back to living in caves, which is to trade goods and services and housing and transportation with each other, as we migrate to a new way of doing that, the infrastructure and financing required to accomplish that is the single largest economic opportunity in the history of the world. Every time you see a building, every time you see a road, a car, an airplane, everything that you see right now is obviously a function of financing. There are no airplanes without financing. There's no cars without financing. There's no houses without financing. There's not a restaurant. There's not a farm. The farms, the airplanes, the houses, and the cars that brought us to this point, for which we are all very grateful, especially to Ferrari, but to all of them, have expired. And now we're at a moment where those in the financial services business who decide to take a leadership role in accomplishing what is possible are the ones that will reap the greatest rewards and are the ones that will define the agenda for the next 50 years of global infrastructure. It's easy, and especially I've been working with Epiphany, so it's easy to get lost in the dialogue of APIs and modules. The best API and the best module is an API or a module that empowers the customer to be able to get what they need in a way that migrates them into a place where they are in the future. The beauty of a place like Italy is because it has one of the most rich and ultimately trusting cultures in the world within the communities themselves. If you can leverage the trust that exists inside of each of the villages, inside each of the communities, and exploit that in a positive way to actually create the momentum to move to where we are going, that the economic opportunity in that is profound. If you were to look at the resistance to all of this, all of it comes from the legacy infrastructure. And so where we've fallen down in this process is too much of our time and too much of our effort has been spent trying to argue with people who have a vested interest in the opposite of what is actually happening. And when you understand that the global shift is an inevitable thing that is happening, in other words, there's no reason to fight, there's no reason to argue about what's going on in this world right now. It's like trying to fight with a river that's flowing. And if you make the decision to acknowledge the way that the river is flowing and acknowledge that you yourselves are in a unique position with the tools necessary in order to move that river forward, you can actually accelerate you can't stop the river, you can't fight the river, but you can accelerate the flow rate of the river with your technology, with your service, with your banking. Banking, I ran corporate finance at Bloomberg for years, and we'd hire new employees, and I would say, why does banking and finance exist? And people would say, well, so you can make money. And I'd say, so you think we have giant central banks and the amount of policy and subsidy that exists for the financial services world to exist so that people can make money? Obviously, the reason banking and finance exists is because it is the circulatory system of everything that we do. And if you find yourself at a time where every single thing that we do is shifting at a higher rate than it ever has before, that yes, creates confusion, yes, creates anxiety, but it also creates the single largest opportunity economically that has ever existed. And so the reason I wanted to I was grateful for the opportunity to talk with you all about this is not because I want you all to make a lot of money hoping to convert every building, airplane, house, and car in Italy and Europe into a post-carbon high-performance device, although I think that would be fun. But because I know that in order for all of us to have the life that we want to live, the resilience, the adaptability, the freedom, and the mobility, we have to have the banking system to support that transition. And remember, people think, oh, well, the government, have you seen the American government? You think the American government's going to take a leadership role in transitioning us to an efficient global distributed system? You do? No. You don't? No. Oh, you have a question? No, I'm saying no. Oh, you're saying no. So you think the Italian government will do it then? No. Who's more likely? No. The banks can. The banks will. You can't change the buildings from the legacy infrastructure to the modern infrastructure without the financing to do it. By providing the financing to do those things, not only do the buildings move to where they are ultimately going to go anyway, but you and I create value for each other and for our communities in the process. It is no longer a moral obligation to migrate because we don't want Sicily or we don't want pick your favorite region to struggle or have unemployment, let alone be underwater from climate change. But it is in our business's self-interest to facilitate this transition at this moment in a way that will create more and more momentum. And so I would only ask that you think about what you are doing, not just in the sense of the technology that you're selling or the programming that you're creating or the interest that you're charging, or the fees that you're charging, or where you're giving it away and then you're going to do this later, all those things. But think about it in the way that you are actually providing the foundation for the transition that we are in, and the transition we are in is the largest transition literally in the history of the world. And when you have the largest transition in the history of the world, you have the largest risks in the history of the world. You have tremendous confusion, you have political extremism, you have all these negatives that people try to focus their attention on. But I would ask that when you find yourself feeling the anxiety that's associated with that transition because of either political uncertainty, a sense of economic uncertainty, a sense of social uncertainty, that you remind yourself that the size of the risk and the size of the anxiety that you may feel is a direct indication of the size of the opportunity that is in front of you at any moment in time. And so when you feel and see the anxiety that's being expressed in our world right now, understand that that is the mirror image of the largest opportunity in the history of the world to migrate in this transition and to enjoy the process, right? A friend of mine was explaining to me earlier today that he believes that comedy is actually the primary purpose of life. And, even though he's like, listen, we'd like to do this, he's like, but I think comedy might be the thing. And I don't necessarily disagree with him. But if comedy is the currency of life, take that attitude into what you are doing and use it as a way to release fear and seize opportunity. Understand that what is happening right now is a once in a millennium scenario. Think about the last time you had to convert the heating, power, and lighting system of every building on Earth. Every transportation device on Earth. Think about the opportunity to empower people around that. And as you go forth with whatever your offering may be, understand that really what you are doing is creating the foundation of human life for the next 100 to 1,000 years as we move away from the things that got us where we are, which we are grateful for. But they have expired in their utility, and they are now a risk to us that can no longer be sustained at a time when the opportunity to make the transition has an incredible amount of value. So anyway, thank you for your attention. that's why I'm here, and that's the perspective that I wanted to offer you. So I appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy your afternoon.
Do you have any questions? He's got a question.
If we just assume that this shift is being driven by technology, that maybe the first sign of the shift was the IT revolution, in communications. Can you talk about some of the potential pitfalls, some of the dangers ahead, and the analogy I would draw in the financing of the shift? And the analogy I would draw is, if the digital revolution first appeared in communication and gave us 25 years of the internet, that internet just sort of ate its own tail in the last 24 months, where social media is now this highly mistrusted detriment to liberal democracy and not a savior, is definitely being blamed in America right now for having shifted an entire election. So if you look at that in the sphere of communication, you look at logistics, the changes in energy regimes, moving from carbon to renewables, which I think is as inevitable as the shift in communication. What are some of the dangers? What do you see macroeconomically that could thwart the shift in these other in green technology and logistics?
So the number one risk when it comes to financing anything is the logical and natural bias for everybody in the financial services world to seek the highest return for the least amount of risk. And as long as you have both the central banks in the United States and in Europe creating environments where it's possible to make money without having to incur any risk, what happens is you have, because of the technology, it's possible for huge pools of capital to move into single locations now in a way that wasn't really possible before very quickly. And so the risk is the degree to which there is a disincentive for anybody involved in financing process at all to participate in the risk that is implied in the transition. And so it's a different, the risk when it comes to this. So here's the distinction. I agree with you when you say that you believe that the first shift was the communication shift. The consequence of the communication shift, the end game now is nobody trusts anybody, there's no longer information, right? The terminus point for that is information no longer exists. Right, yeah. Which by definition means it doesn't exist. What we're talking about now is the infrastructure, right? So we're no longer talking about the exchange of information and the transportation and communication reality that we've migrated into. We're now talking about every building, every car, every road in the world moving to that place. And fortunately, we don't rely on buildings, cars, and roads for information. The risk when it comes to the infrastructure relative to financing is that the desire or the incentive to finance continues to be betrayed by a central banking system that continues to try to create environments that incentivize capital to avoid risk at all costs because the money's too easy, buying treasuries or buying Eurobonds or whatever it is, and rolling. The thing that most frustrates me when I look at the global financial markets right now is the amount of capital, taxpayer-subsidized capital in most cases, that rolls around in this risk-free financing of government budgets as opposed to being more widely available or at least incentivized for investment to do what's happening. It's also why I was so encouraged by what they did do in California, which I think is an indication of a little bit of a shift, at least at the edge of where that is.